The New York Times, the day after the assassination, after Oswald had been arrested, laid out the facts pretty clearly that this is a man who had defected to the Soviet Union in 1959, former Marine, lived in the Soviet Union for 2.5 years, married a Russian woman, then returned to the United States in 1962 with his Russian wife and relocated to the Dallas area, and had somewhat become obsessed with Castro, especially in the wake of the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. So the New York Times had all this the day after the assassination. In other words, the blunt facts. And if you go back and look at that article, none of those facts have really been challenged to any significant degree that the Times reports. But adjacent to the article about Oswald on the front page of the New York Times on November 23rd, 1963, was a column by James Reston. Reston was the Washington bureau chief of the New York Times and probably the dean of political writers, journalists in the United States at that time. And his column went on to suggest that it was a spirit of a climate of hatred in the country that led to the assassination of John F. Kennedy. And he linked it to violence against civil rights workers across the South and an attack on a United Nations ambassador, Adlai Stevenson, who had just been to Dallas a few weeks before, and basically disassociated the act from the Cold War and from Oswald. So Reston kind of painted a picture of the assassination that suggested that it was deep forces of hatred in the United States that were responsible for Kennedy's death. And when you ask which of these two narratives was going to determine how the public interpreted the assassination, was it an act in the Cold War, as suggested by Oswald's Soviet and communist background, or an event in the civil rights movement, as evidenced by the presence of right-wingers in Dallas and events that had taken place across the summer of 1963? Well, it turned out the dominant interpretation, narrative as we now call it, was that this was an event in the civil rights movement. And he was a victim, Kennedy was a victim of forces of hatred and intolerance and bigotry in the United States.